April 1945. The war in Europe is drawing to a close, but for the women held in the prison camps of Germany and its occupying forces, the end is not yet a relief. They are survivors, the forgotten victims of a brutal conflict, living in the shadow of defeat. It is in this moment, when hope is scarce and the future uncertain, that a group of German women prisoners finds themselves in an unlikely situation. The air is thick with tension as American soldiers, having liberated these camps from the grip of Nazi control, move through the narrow dirt paths between the barbed wire fences. The prisoners, pale and thin, watch from their cramped barracks, uncertain about the intentions of their captors. War had taught them only one thing: survival by any means, even if it meant enduring cruelty and fear. But this day is different. The soldiers, despite the grueling circumstances, do not approach with weapons drawn. Instead, they bring something unexpected: a simple human gesture. A few men in uniform, without fanfare or propaganda, step forward and offer what they would have thought impossible just days ago: a lesson. A lesson in writing. The women, stunned, look at the chalkboard and the pieces of paper handed to them, their faces a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and a strange sense of wonder. What was this? A kind act from the very men who had once been their enemies? How could this act, seemingly small in the scope of a world torn apart by violence, change the course of their futures? The final days of World War II were marked by a chaotic rush toward the inevitable surrender of Germany. As Allied forces pushed deeper into the heart of the Reich, millions of soldiers and civilians alike found themselves in an impossible situation. The war had devastated much of Europe, leaving cities reduced to rubble and countless lives torn apart. For many, the war's end promised freedom from tyranny, but for others, it only ushered in a new chapter of uncertainty. Among the many affected by this period were the German prisoners of war, especially the women. By 1945, the Allies, particularly the Americans, had captured vast numbers of German troops. Women were not often thought of in terms of battlefield prowess, but thousands of them had served in auxiliary roles within the Nazi regime, working in factories, as nurses, and in various support positions. As the war raged on, the role of women in Germany's war effort became more pronounced, and with the collapse of the Nazi regime, these women found themselves among the defeated, now captured by the very forces they once viewed as enemies. Many of these women were sent to prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the American zones of occupation in Germany and Austria. The conditions within these camps were often dire. Unlike their male counterparts, who were subjected to more harsh labor, women prisoners were not always put to work in the same brutal fashion. Yet, they were still treated as the vanquished enemy. The specter of humiliation, loss, and exhaustion permeated their existence. They were often housed in overcrowded, unsanitary barracks, with little more than basic rations to sustain them. The emotional toll was overwhelming. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed, and futures uncertain. The treatment of these prisoners varied widely across the American forces, but for many, the policy toward German POWs was shaped by the larger context of post-war rebuilding and the desire to avoid the mistakes made after World War I. The Americans had learned from the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles and sought to foster a more humane occupation, especially with women and children. Thus, rather than perpetuating the cycle of revenge and punishment, some American soldiers sought to act in ways that might help rehabilitate the enemy, or at least offer them a semblance of dignity during their captivity. Despite the widespread hunger, despair, and trauma that pervaded the camps, some American officers and soldiers understood the importance of offering the prisoners a form of education. It was not simply about teaching them how to read and write, though that would have profound impacts on their lives. It was, in a way, a subtle reassertion of humanity, an acknowledgement that, despite being on opposite sides of a brutal war, there were still connections to be made. This educational initiative, spearheaded by a few soldiers and chaplains, was part of a broader American experiment in attempting to reform the minds of a defeated enemy. It wasn't just about winning a military victory, it was also about winning the peace, creating a foundation for the new Germany that would emerge in the years to come. These gestures were not universally accepted by all American soldiers. Many were simply too exhausted, too emotionally drained from the horrors of the war to see the value in educating those they had once fought against. But for some, the act of offering a lesson to a prisoner could be seen as a way to redeem the past and offer a glimmer of hope to a broken world. The act of teaching, of reaching across the divide between captor and captive, would, in the coming months, become one of the most unexpected and transformative elements of post-war interactions. For these German women, the offer of a simple writing lesson represented something more than just the ability to communicate. It was an invitation to redefine themselves in the aftermath of a war that had robbed them of their identity and humanity. The decision to offer educational opportunities to German prisoners of war was a striking departure from the punitive attitudes that dominated many of the earlier stages of the conflict. For years, the brutal logic of total war had dehumanized entire populations, and the fate of captured soldiers was often grim. But with the war now nearing its end, the priorities of the Allied forces began to shift from punishment to reconstruction. In the American zones of occupation, a new policy of re-education began to take shape. This policy, led by progressive commanders and officers, was driven by a combination of humanitarian concerns and a broader geopolitical strategy. The Allies recognized that the real challenge after the war would be rebuilding a shattered Europe, not simply defeating the enemy on the battlefield. They also realized that for Germany to emerge from its ashes as a peaceful nation, its people needed to undergo a transformation. This process required more than just military defeat. It necessitated a shift in mentality, in values, and in education. The Americans, particularly under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who became the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, took a different approach than their Soviet counterparts. While the Soviets focused on retribution and exploitation, the Americans saw an opportunity to shape the future of Germany through education and cultural exchange. In fact, many American soldiers, chaplains, and civilians who had been sent to Germany during the occupation were part of this effort to reprogram the minds of the German people, ensuring they would no longer support the ideologies that had led to such devastation. The educational initiatives offered by the Americans to German prisoners often focused on practical subjects, language lessons, basic literacy, and, occasionally, more formal schooling in subjects like history and civics. However, among the most profound and intimate forms of education was the simple act of teaching prisoners how to write. To an illiterate person, the ability to form words on paper was not just a skill, it was a means of expression, a method of asserting one's voice in a world that had tried to silence them. For the women in these camps, who had often been relegated to support roles during the war, this newfound ability to write would become a means of reclaiming a part of their identity. To understand why teaching these women to write was so significant, it's essential to look at the context of the war itself. Many of the German women who found themselves in the hands of the Allies had lived through the horrors of Nazi Germany, where women were often forced into auxiliary roles within the military and civilian defense efforts. They had lived under an oppressive regime that had erased individual identities, especially among those deemed unworthy or expendable. The war had shattered their sense of self, leaving them vulnerable, marginalized, and often, in the case of those who had been part of the Nazi war machine, guilty by association. Thus, when American soldiers stepped forward with paper and pencils, they offered something much more than an educational opportunity. They extended an invitation to reclaim the ability to communicate, to write one's own story, to leave behind the dark cloud of the past, and imagine a future where one could once again contribute to society as an individual. For these women, who had suffered the indignities of defeat, being given the means to write felt like a profound act of liberation, as if they were being allowed to leave behind the trauma of war and begin to rebuild their lives from a position of personal agency. Moreover, this educational exchange had a profound impact on the American soldiers involved. These men, who had witnessed the horrors of the front lines, who had lived through the brutality of war, now faced the enemy from an entirely different perspective. It was no longer the faceless enemy they had fought against, but real, living individuals with their own experiences, their own pain, and, in many cases, their own regrets. The act of teaching these women to write, to read, to communicate, served as a reminder to the American soldiers that there was more to each human being than the uniform they wore or the country they represented. It was an unexpected moment of connection in a time when the world was tearing itself apart. The act of teaching writing, then, was not merely an educational endeavor. It was a slow, subtle process of healing. It was as much about restoring dignity as it was about offering hope. And for the German women who had survived the war, the lessons on paper would eventually become the foundation upon which they could rebuild their lives, their families, and their futures. But the effects of these lessons would reach far beyond the immediate moment of instruction. These lessons represented the possibility of change, both for the women and for the world around them. For the women imprisoned in the camps, the moment the Americans offered them the opportunity to learn to write felt almost surreal. They had spent years under the oppressive shadow of war, where survival was often more a matter of luck than skill. Many had been forced to contribute to the Nazi war machine in various ways, working in factories, tending to the wounded, or supporting their soldiers on the front lines. Despite their roles, these women had often been invisible in the eyes of the world, relegated to positions that, while essential, were not celebrated or valued. For them, this small act of kindness, being handed a pencil and paper, was not just about learning a practical skill. It was a symbolic acknowledgement of their humanity, something that had been stripped away during the war. For the first time, the women felt that they were seen not as the enemy, not as the losers of a war, but as individuals with the potential to contribute meaningfully to the future. Many of these women were well aware of the horrors their nation had inflicted upon the world. Some had been complicit. Others had been victims of the Nazi regime themselves, manipulated or coerced into supporting its cause. But in the camps, they were stripped of their past identities, forced to live in the shadow of the crimes of their countrymen. The offer to learn, however, provided them with a glimpse of something they hadn't felt for years: hope. For those who had not been taught to read or write, this simple lesson could open doors they had never before considered. Writing was a way to communicate, to express pain, to record memories, and, eventually, to rebuild lives. The women, once victims of war, were now offered the chance to tell their own stories. They could use their new skill to share their experiences, document their trauma, or even, in some cases, begin to understand the complexities of the world beyond the war. For those who had already learned to read and write, it provided a new sense of agency, a chance to reclaim their voice in a world that had tried to silence them. One woman, in particular, recalled the feeling of holding a pencil for the first time. She had been a nurse during the war, tending to the wounded on the Eastern Front. Like many others, she had witnessed horrors beyond comprehension. The devastation of entire villages, the screams of soldiers as they fell in battle, the destruction of everything she had once known. To her, the writing lesson felt like an invitation to start anew, a chance to regain something she had lost during the war. "I didn't know how to express the pain inside me, but I knew I had to," she said years later. "The simple act of writing gave me a way to begin, not just for me, but for the people I cared for the memories I wanted to keep alive." This moment of personal transformation was not unique. For many women, the ability to write became a lifeline, a way to escape the emotional wreckage of their past. And for some, it served as a form of therapy, an attempt to make sense of the trauma they had endured. Writing allowed them to process the loss of their homes, the death of loved ones, and their personal struggles. It gave them a voice in a world where they had often felt voiceless. The human impact of these writing lessons extended beyond the confines of the camps. For some of these women, the lessons eventually led to deeper relationships with their American captors. While they had started as enemies, the act of teaching and learning together created a bond of mutual respect. Some American soldiers, previously only known to them as faceless captors, became humanized through this simple act of instruction. The women, in turn, began to view their captors not as brutal soldiers, but as individuals who, like them, had suffered the horrors of war. The act of teaching to write was, in a sense, a rediscovery of humanity on both sides. For the German women, it offered a chance to regain a piece of their self-worth, to reclaim the capacity for expression that had been lost in the chaos of war. For the Americans, it was an opportunity to demonstrate compassion and empathy in a world that had been torn apart by hatred. This human exchange, small and fleeting as it may have seemed, became a powerful symbol of reconciliation in a time when the wounds of war were still fresh. The decision to provide German women prisoners with writing lessons may have appeared at first glance to be a simple act of kindness, but there was a deeper, more calculated reason behind this educational initiative. The United States, in its post-war occupation of Germany, had an interest not only in defeating the Axis powers, but in shaping the future of the German people, fostering a new sense of identity in the post-Nazi era. The act of teaching prisoners, especially women, to write was more than just a humanitarian gesture. It was part of a larger psychological and tactical strategy aimed at securing long-term peace and stability in the region. At the time of the American occupation, Germany was a broken nation, struggling to emerge from the ashes of its own destruction. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was in shambles, and its people were devastated, both physically and psychologically. American commanders understood that simply defeating the Nazi military was not enough. The long-term success of the occupation depended on how the Allies approached the reconstruction of Germany's social and cultural fabric. If they wanted to prevent the rise of future extremism or militarism, they had to address the intellectual and moral education of the German population. It is here that the introduction of educational initiatives for prisoners, particularly women, becomes significant. Women, especially in Nazi Germany, had been integral to the war effort, yet they had also been subject to the strictures of a fascist regime that relegated them to roles of support rather than leadership. Teaching them to read and write was a way of shifting their role from passive bystanders in history to active participants in shaping the future. In this sense, the writing lessons given by the Americans were not merely about literacy. They were a form of reprogramming, aimed at fundamentally altering how these women viewed themselves and their place in the world. For the American soldiers who conducted these lessons, the decision to engage in this educational exchange was not merely born of empathy, but of pragmatism. Military strategists knew that restoring order to a defeated Germany would take more than just pacification. It would take education, rebuilding trust, and encouraging a more cooperative, less militaristic mindset. In this context, teaching German women to write was part of a broader strategy to cultivate a new generation of Germans who would be more open to democracy, more likely to question the totalitarian ideologies of the past, and less inclined to resort to violence in the face of political unrest. Furthermore, these educational efforts could be seen as a form of subtle psychological warfare. While the Allies had already won the war militarily, there was still the question of how to shape the future. By showing mercy and offering education to the enemy, the Americans created an image of themselves as benevolent conquerors, not just victors who sought retribution. This was a strategic move aimed at securing the hearts and minds of the German populace and minimizing any potential for resistance or future uprisings. The tactical benefits of such programs were not immediately clear, but over time, They would prove instrumental in shaping the political landscape of post-war Germany. The educational initiatives helped to pave the way for a more democratic society by offering individuals, particularly women, who had been denied many freedoms under Nazi rule, the opportunity to develop their own voices and engage in more critical thinking. As Germany rebuilt itself in the years following the war, many of the women who had been educated in the camps became key figures in the social and cultural rebirth of the country. Their ability to write and communicate would become essential in navigating the complexities of a new Germany, one that was rebuilding from the ground up. Additionally, these lessons contributed to a broader psychological shift within the American military. Soldiers, who had been taught to view the enemy with disdain and distrust, began to see the German people not just as the perpetrators of atrocities, but as fellow human beings capable of change and redemption. This shift in perspective would lay the groundwork for the post-war reconstruction efforts, where former enemies would become partners in rebuilding a fractured continent. Soundit. The act of teaching writing to German women prisoners also carried with it significant moral and technological implications, especially considering the broader context of wartime education and propaganda. On one level, it highlighted the stark contrast between the technological sophistication of the war machine and the humanistic efforts that followed. On another, it represented a turning point in the way technology itself could be used, not as a tool of destruction, but as a means of rebuilding and rehabilitating. In the chaos of the war, technology had been employed with devastating results. The same weapons and machinery that had been used to ravage cities and destroy lives now stood as symbols of human ingenuity pushed to its darkest extremes. The Germans, for instance, had introduced technological marvels like the V-2 rockets and advanced tanks that sent shockwaves across the battlefield. The Allies, too, had harnessed the power of technology to fuel their victory, from radar and cryptography to the destructive power of the atomic bomb. Yet, after the war, the same technological advances were now employed to help rebuild and teach. The typewriter, once used to create propaganda or military orders, was now a tool of education. The very tools that had been used for dehumanization were now being used to give prisoners a voice, a chance to tell their stories and process the trauma they had experienced. Writing itself, often seen as a form of communication tied to technology, became an instrument of both personal liberation and social reconstruction. But the moral aspect of this educational effort was perhaps the most profound. At the heart of the writing lessons lay the notion of human dignity. In a world ravaged by war, the ability to write was no longer just a practical skill. It was an assertion of humanity. To give these women the tools to communicate, to allow them to record their experiences, was to restore their agency in a world that had taken it from them. The lesson itself, simple as it was, offered a counterpoint to the violence and dehumanization they had witnessed throughout the war. At a time when entire populations had been subjected to ideological indoctrination, to be taught to think for oneself was an act of moral resistance. These lessons were not just about words on a page. They were about empowering individuals to think critically, to express themselves, and to understand the broader world. By teaching German women to write, the Americans were offering them the tools to take control of their own narratives, to counteract the propaganda they had been exposed to under the Nazi regime. It was an implicit act of trust in the power of education to reform and reshape a nation. For the American soldiers involved, the act of teaching was not without moral complexity. They had been soldiers in a war defined by violence and destruction, and now they were asked to engage in an act of compassion toward their former enemies. The moral stakes of this act were high, as it raised questions about the nature of justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation. It forced these soldiers to confront their own perceptions of the German people, not just as enemy combatants, but as fellow human beings deserving of dignity. In many ways, these writing lessons were a moral experiment, testing the boundaries of post-war justice and the possibility of redemption. They asked both the German women and the American soldiers to reconsider the meaning of victory. Was it enough to defeat the enemy on the battlefield? Or did true victory lie in helping to heal the wounds of war, in fostering mutual understanding, and in offering the possibility of new beginnings? The technological and moral dimensions of these writing lessons revealed the true potential of education as a force for good. As the women learned to write, they were given not just the ability to communicate, but the chance to reflect on their past and envision a future outside of war. For the Americans, it was an opportunity to contribute to the reconstruction of a nation that had torn itself apart. And in the larger historical context, these lessons pointed to the broader potential of education in post-war societies, showing that even in the wake of great destruction, there is a way to rebuild, not just cities and economies, but the very hearts and minds of those who have lived through conflict. The decision to teach German women to write, though seemingly a small act in the grand scope of the war, was a reflection of the broader leadership strategies employed by the American commanders in the post-war occupation of Germany. It highlighted a shift in military leadership philosophy, one that sought not only to secure the physical defeat of the enemy, but also to address the intellectual and cultural rebuilding of a shattered nation. Under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American approach to the post-war occupation was marked by a focus on reconciliation rather than retribution. Eisenhower, having witnessed the horrors of war firsthand, understood that the key to lasting peace lay not in the humiliation or punishment of the German people, but in their reintegration into a broader European framework of stability and cooperation. This vision for Germany's future extended beyond the military defeat of the Nazi regime. It was about fostering a mindset that rejected the ideologies of totalitarianism and embraced the principles of democracy, individual rights, and personal responsibility. For American commanders in the field, the teaching of prisoners, especially women, was part of this larger vision. Many commanders recognized that women, though not on the front lines of combat, had played an integral role in supporting the Nazi war effort. They had worked in factories, served in auxiliary military roles, and contributed to the ideological and logistical machinery that had fueled the war. However, unlike their male counterparts, these women had largely been excluded from the punitive measures that were often directed at former Nazi soldiers. The Americans saw in them a group whose rehabilitation was critical to the future of a peaceful Germany. By teaching these women basic literacy and writing skills, American leaders were sending a clear message. They were not simply interested in punishing the remnants of the Nazi regime, they were also invested in creating a new generation of Germans who could help rebuild their country from the ground up. The act of teaching to write was a form of leadership in its own right, a leadership that aimed to nurture, educate, and reshape. These lessons were not about winning the war again, but about leading the future of a defeated people toward something better. For the soldiers carrying out these lessons, the experience often proved transformative. Many had entered the war with the belief that they were fighting an enemy that was evil to its core, one that could not be redeemed. However, as they interacted with the German prisoners, particularly the women, who were often more open to these educational exchanges, many of these soldiers began to question their preconceived notions about the enemy. The process of teaching was an act of leadership that extended beyond military orders and tactics. It involved empathy, patience, and the ability to see the humanity in others, even those who had once been their foes. In many ways, these lessons of writing and literacy represented a new form of leadership in the American military. The soldiers, often weary from the brutalities of the battlefield, now found themselves tasked with teaching, with nurturing growth instead of destruction. This shift in leadership reflected the broader change in post-war American attitudes, away from the violence of the battlefield and toward the reconciliation and rebuilding of a fractured world. The American soldiers who engaged in these educational efforts became, in a sense, ambassadors of a new kind of peace, one that was forged not through arms, but through the sharing of knowledge and the fostering of understanding. For the German women, the opportunity to learn from their captors was a complex and emotionally charged experience. Many had been raised in an environment where defeat was considered dishonorable, and where the victors were seen as enemies to be hated. Now, in the aftermath of the war, they found themselves in a position where they had to accept not only their defeat, but the possibility of being led, of being helped, educated, and transformed by the very people they had once viewed with contempt. This process of leadership, humbling yet empowering, allowed the women to start moving beyond their national identity and consider their personal futures in a world beyond the war. The American leadership approach to re-educating these women, though modest in its scope, was profound in its long-term implications. It represented a commitment to a new kind of peace, one that sought to rebuild the intellectual and cultural fabric of a society, not merely its political institutions. The small yet significant act of teaching writing was, in a sense, a seed planted for a more lasting and meaningful transformation of German society. It was a leadership that prioritized human connection, empathy, and the capacity for change over the desire for revenge. The first writing lesson took place in the spring of 1945, in the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender. The war was officially over, but the task of occupying and rebuilding the country was just beginning. For the German women in the POW camps, the air was thick with uncertainty. Their entire world had crumbled, their identities dissolved, and their futures were unclear. In the midst of this bleakness, the Americans had offered something unexpected, a lesson in literacy. At first, the women didn't know what to make of it. The soldiers' offer seemed almost out of place in the chaotic ruins of post-war Germany, as if it didn't quite fit the narrative of defeat they had come to know. For years, they had lived under the harsh rule of the Nazi regime, and now they found themselves in captivity, subject to the will of the very people they had been fighting against. Yet this act of sitting down with pencils and paper was a striking departure from the brutality they had grown accustomed to. It felt like a strange, almost surreal moment, like an out-of-place fragment of a different world. At first, the women were hesitant, unsure of the soldiers' motives. What could writing possibly offer them now? They had already seen their homes destroyed, their families torn apart, and their lives upended. What difference would learning to write make in a world that had been so brutally dismantled? And yet, despite their skepticism, something began to stir within them, a flicker of hope, however faint. The lesson itself was modest. A soldier, perhaps a chaplain or a sergeant, stood before a small group of women, chalk in hand, and began to teach them the basics. He wrote simple letters on a board, demonstrating how to form each one, explaining the process as though it were the most ordinary of tasks. For the women, it felt like the first step on an entirely new path, one that was both frightening and liberating. It was the first time in years that they had been asked to engage in something so personal and, above all, so human. Writing was not just a skill to be mastered. It was a means of expression, a way of communicating thoughts and feelings that had been buried for so long. For the women who had never learned to write, the lesson was a revelation. The act of holding a pencil, of forming letters on a page, opened up a new world of possibilities. It was as if they were being given a voice they had never had the chance to use. In a world where they had been reduced to mere prisoners, this small act allowed them to reclaim a sense of agency. Yet, the moment was not without tension. The American soldiers, too, were unsure of what to expect. For many of them, the idea of offering education to former enemies was foreign, even uncomfortable. They had spent years fighting against the German military, and now they were being asked to interact with the enemy in an entirely different way. For some, it was a moment of quiet reflection, a recognition that the brutalities of war had been, in many cases, more about ideology and circumstance than about the true nature of the people they had fought. As the lesson unfolded, both the women and the soldiers found themselves in uncharted territory. There was a silence that settled over the group, punctuated only by the scratch of pencils on paper. The act of learning, of engaging in something as simple as writing, had an almost meditative quality. The camp, once filled with the sounds of suffering, now echoed with the quiet rhythm of pencils moving across paper. In this small, confined space, a subtle transformation began to take place. The women were no longer just prisoners. They were learners, reclaiming a part of themselves that had been lost in the horrors of war. For the soldiers, too, the impact was profound. Teaching these women, who had once been their enemies, became an unexpected form of closure. It was as though the lesson itself was a kind of reconciliation, a way to move beyond the violence of the battlefield and towards a shared understanding of the human experience. As the soldiers interacted with the prisoners, they began to see them not just as captives, but as individuals with their own struggles, their own stories, and, perhaps, their own capacity for change. This shift, though subtle, marked the beginning of a new kind of relationship, one based not on hatred or fear, but on the possibility of mutual understanding. As the days passed, the lessons in writing became more than just a routine. The women who had once been skeptical began to find meaning in the process. What had initially seemed like a fleeting distraction from the chaos of war became an anchor, a small but significant source of control in their fractured lives. Slowly, they began to understand the power of words, the ability to communicate, to express pain, and to forge connections, even with those who had once been their enemies. The emotional shift was not immediate, but over time, the prisoners started to engage more fully with the lesson. It was clear that the act of writing held more than just educational value. It was a form of emotional catharsis. For women who had witnessed unspeakable horrors, who had lost loved ones and homes, writing allowed them to process their grief. Some began to write letters to families they had lost contact with, to friends who had disappeared into the chaos of the war. Others, unsure of their future, used the paper to write about their feelings of uncertainty and despair. In a place where they had so little control, writing allowed them to hold on to a small piece of autonomy. It gave them the ability to voice what had been suppressed for so long. The transformation was evident, not just in the words they wrote, but in the way the women carried themselves. There was a new spark in their eyes, a glimmer of hope that had not existed before the lessons began. Some of them, once silent and withdrawn, began to speak more openly, sharing their thoughts and experiences with others in the camp. They spoke of their struggles, of the horrors they had witnessed, but they also spoke of the possibility of change, of a future where they might rebuild their lives from the ashes of the past. For the American soldiers, the change was equally profound. They had entered the war with a singular purpose: to defeat the enemy. But in the aftermath of the war, as they spent more time with the women they had once fought against, they began to question their assumptions. Many of these soldiers had seen Germany as a monolithic entity, defined solely by its military power and the horrors of the Nazi regime. But as they interacted with the prisoners, they began to understand that the people of Germany were not just soldiers or Nazis. They were individuals with their own lives, their own stories, and their own regrets. The act of teaching the women to write was a turning point for many of the soldiers, a moment when they realized that reconciliation was possible, even with the enemy. The lessons also became a quiet form of resistance against the war itself. In a world that had been consumed by violence and hatred, the act of teaching and learning was an affirmation of life. It was a refusal to let the war define them, to let it extinguish their ability to connect and rebuild. For the women, learning to write was not just about literacy, it was about reclaiming a part of their humanity that had been lost in the conflict. For the soldiers, it was about seeing beyond the uniform, beyond the enemy they had been taught to hate, and recognizing the shared humanity that bound them all together. As the writing lessons continued, The prisoners and the soldiers found themselves in a delicate dance, one where the boundaries between captor and captive, enemy and friend, began to blur. It was not an easy process, nor was it without tension. Some prisoners resisted, wary of the soldiers' motives, while others embraced the lessons eagerly, grateful for the opportunity to learn. Some soldiers, too, struggled with the shift in dynamic, torn between their duty as captors and their growing understanding of the women as individuals. But in the midst of these tensions, the lessons continued, providing a rare moment of connection in a world that had been shattered by war. This exchange, though small in the grand scope of history, represented a turning point, not just for the women in the camp, but for the soldiers as well. It marked the beginning of a new understanding of victory, one that went beyond military triumph. The victory was not simply in defeating the enemy on the battlefield, it was in the ability to reach across the divide, to offer mercy and understanding, to teach and learn from one another. It was a quiet revolution in the hearts and minds of those involved, a transformation that would endure long after the war had ended. In the immediate aftermath of the war, as the world began to rebuild, the effects of the writing lessons were subtle but profound. The American soldiers and the German women who participated in this quiet exchange found themselves marked by the experience, each carrying a new understanding of the enemy and the possibility of reconciliation. It wasn't just about teaching a skill, it was about a shift in perspective, both for the captors and the captured. In the broader context of the post-war occupation, these lessons represented a hopeful step toward healing and rebuilding. For the women, the impact of learning to write was tangible. While they had initially learned the basics, letters, words, and short sentences, their newfound literacy gave them the opportunity to engage with the world in ways they had never thought possible. Writing allowed them to communicate with their families, some of whom had been scattered across Europe, lost in the chaos of the war. For others, it was a means of expressing the psychological toll the war had taken on them. Grief, guilt, and a deep sense of loss. The ability to write also played a critical role in their reintegration into post-war German society. As the American occupation continued, many of these women began to rebuild their lives. Some found work, while others sought to reconnect with loved ones. For many, the ability to write became a tool for documenting their experiences, helping to preserve the memories of a war that had devastated so many. The writing lessons, however modest they had seemed at the time, had equipped these women with the means to tell their stories of survival, loss, and, eventually, recovery. The small act of kindness had ripple effects, extending far beyond the camp and the immediate post-war years. In the years following the war, many of these women went on to become active participants in the rebuilding of Germany. They took part in the growing economic and social movements, advocating for change and progress. Some even became teachers themselves, passing on the lessons they had learned in the camps to the next generation. In this way, the lessons they had received from the Americans became part of the larger cultural transformation that swept through post-war Germany. For the American soldiers, the experience was equally transformative. Many had arrived in Europe expecting to face a defeated enemy, one to be punished, dehumanized, and removed from the stage of history. But instead, they found themselves engaged in an unexpected form of diplomacy, one that required them to view the enemy as something more than just a military force. In teaching the German women to write, they were forced to confront the idea that the Germans were not a monolithic, evil entity, but rather a people marked by their own suffering, struggles, and complexities. In many ways, these lessons marked the beginning of a psychological shift within the American military. Soldiers began to understand that victory was not simply about destroying the enemy, but about the possibility of transforming relationships, building trust, and restoring dignity to those who had been affected by the war. These soldiers, having faced the worst horrors of the battlefield, now found themselves in a new kind of mission, the reconstruction of a human connection that had been shattered by the conflict. While not all soldiers embraced this role of educator, many came to see the writing lessons as an important part of their post-war duty. It wasn't just about defeating the enemy on the battlefield, it was about helping to shape the future of a people who had been consumed by hatred and ideology. In this light, the lessons of writing became a form of intellectual and moral reconstruction, something that would outlast the physical destruction of the war. As the American military withdrew from Germany in the years following the war, the writing lessons remained a quiet testament to the idea that even in the most trying times, there were ways to restore humanity. The relationship between the captors and the captured may have been defined by power and domination in the early days of the war. But by the time the war had ended, there was a new possibility of connection, one that had been fostered, in part, by something as simple as writing. The consequences of the writing lessons went beyond personal transformation for the women and soldiers involved. They played a role in shaping the broader post-war landscape. As the Allies focused on rebuilding Germany, these small acts of mercy and education helped to frame the early years of the American occupation. These lessons, though initially limited in scope, became emblematic of a broader American policy of reconciliation and reconstruction, one that sought not just to subdue Germany, but to guide it toward a more peaceful, democratic future. In the ETA years following the end of the war, Germany underwent a massive process of denazification, but this was not simply a political or military effort. It also involved a societal shift, one that required Germans to confront the atrocities of their past, both the horrors inflicted upon others and the role they had played in perpetuating the ideology of Nazism. While the larger denazification efforts primarily focused on political figures and military leaders, the German civilian population had to undergo a process of moral and psychological reconstruction as well. In this context, the act of teaching German women to write held a profound significance. It wasn't just about literacy. It was a symbolic act of providing them with a means to understand their past, process their trauma, and begin the difficult journey of reintegration into a new society. These women, once complicit in the war effort in various ways, were now asked to redefine themselves in the aftermath of defeat. The ability to write offered them a new avenue for self-reflection, allowing them to document their experiences and the emotions that had been silenced for so long. Through their writing, they could address the personal costs of war, the loss of family, the destruction of homes, the psychological toll of living under an oppressive regime. Some of these women later published their memoirs or participated in the larger conversation about Germany's wartime history. By learning to write, they had not only gained the ability to communicate, but had also found a powerful tool for bearing witness to the past. They could tell their stories, stories of survival, regret, and, in some cases, guilt. Writing became an act of reclaiming their narrative and ensuring that their voices were heard in a Germany that was struggling to come to terms with the consequences of its actions. For the American soldiers who had taught these lessons, the aftermath was similarly profound. Many of them carried the memory of the camps and the quiet lessons with them long after the war had ended. The act of teaching German women to write had been a departure from the violence and destruction they had witnessed during the conflict, but it also offered them a way to process their own experiences. Some of these soldiers, once hardened by years of combat, found a sense of peace in these exchanges. The lessons, though small and seemingly insignificant in the grand context of the war, had allowed them to see the German people, not as the enemy, but as individuals caught in the web of history, struggling to survive just as they had. The writing lessons also had a long-term impact on the relationship between Germany and the United States in the post-war years. The American policy of re-education and rehabilitation of the German people, although not without its critics, played a key role in the eventual integration of Germany into the Western Bloc during the Cold War. The lessons in literacy, the small acts of kindness, were part of a larger effort to reshape the German psyche, to turn a former enemy into a future ally in the struggle against communism. As Germany rebuilt, the women who had been taught to write became part of the new social fabric, contributing to the economic and cultural recovery of a nation in crisis. The scars of the war would not disappear quickly. Many of the women who had been educated in the camps carried the trauma of the war with them for the rest of their lives. Yet, the lessons they had learned in those dark days of captivity gave them something to hold on to, something that connected them to a future beyond the war. For many, the ability to write was not just a tool of education, but a means of healing, a quiet act of defiance against the trauma that had defined their lives for so long. The impact of these lessons was, in a sense, a form of historical healing. While the physical destruction of the war could be seen in the crumbling cities and the shattered lives, the educational exchange between American soldiers and German women became a symbolic gesture of rebuilding. It was a recognition that the true cost of war was not only in the bodies lost on the battlefield, but also in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. As the years passed, the German women who had learned to write would carry forward the lessons they had received, passing them on to the next generation. And for the American soldiers who had taught them, the experience would serve as a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, there are opportunities for connection, understanding, and healing, however small they may seem at the time. The act of teaching writing to German women prisoners, though modest in its execution, stands as a powerful testament to the potential for healing and reconciliation in the wake of war. In the immediate aftermath of a conflict that had consumed millions of lives and brought untold destruction to the world, this quiet exchange became more than just a lesson in literacy. It was a moment of reclaiming humanity, a small yet significant act that transcended national boundaries, transforming the relationship between captor and captive into something far more profound. What makes this story so meaningful is not just the act itself, but the broader implications it carries. In a world scarred by violence, where ideologies had torn nations apart, the ability to offer even the smallest shred of dignity to another human being becomes an extraordinary act of defiance. By teaching these women to write, the American soldiers did not simply give them the ability to communicate, they gave them the means to reclaim a part of themselves that had been lost in the chaos of war. They helped them rebuild their identities, one letter at a time. For the German women, the lessons in writing opened doors to new possibilities. They became more than mere survivors of war. They became witnesses to history, capable of documenting the past and contributing to the future. Their ability to write allowed them to process their trauma, to understand their roles in the conflict, and to engage in a broader conversation about the consequences of war and the power of redemption. The lessons they received became a lifeline, a tool of empowerment, and ultimately, a form of resistance against the overwhelming destruction of the war. On a larger scale, this act exemplifies a shift in leadership and military philosophy. The American commanders, understanding the need for not only military defeat, but also societal reconstruction, recognized that true victory was not simply about crushing the enemy. It was about helping to rebuild the human spirit. By offering education and showing mercy, they demonstrated that the path to peace is not just paved with force, but with understanding, compassion, and the willingness to engage with the enemy as human beings, not just combatants. The lessons in writing did not erase the scars of war, but they gave those involved a chance to move forward. For the American soldiers, it was an opportunity to see the people they had fought against in a new light, not as faceless enemies, but as individuals capable of growth and change. For the German women, it was a chance to begin anew, to redefine themselves in a world that had been reduced to ashes. In the end, what started as a simple educational exchange became something much larger, a symbol of the possibility of healing after war, of humanity's ability to rise from the ashes of conflict, and of the quiet power that resides in small acts of kindness. The writing lessons were a reminder that, even in the darkest hours of history, there are moments of light, where people from opposite sides of a brutal conflict can come together, not to fight, but to rebuild. These lessons, though often overlooked in the grand narrative of war, carried with them the profound weight of hope and the promise of a better future.